So, answer to the question that I posed in the title of the seminar, evidently is, from my perspective, interregionalism doesn't really exist. Lots of people thought it was going to flourish in the late 1990s, early 2000s, because of all these regional-like organizations shooting out of the ground everywhere. But in actual fact, with the benefit of hindsight, looking back over these last 15, 20 years, most of these regional organizations haven't really come to very much. They don't have a lot of power over their member states and a lot of issue areas, and therefore interregionalism, basically, as I've defined it, isn't really politically feasible. Yeah.
The EU, do you think that will, disabandon?
Will it stay that way? Well, we'll come to that as we progress during the second part of the session, hopefully. Yeah? But in any case, I don't want to sort of stop the seminar here. Otherwise, it might be possible. But instead, I want to sort of relax my rather stringent definition of interregionalism and talk about those sort of patterns of interregional cooperation which do exist across the world. And in particular, I want to start off by suggesting that, in actual fact, it's not a region, of course, but since it's a continent, at least, one might consider the United States as a kind of region, given the expanse of the territory of the United States, which covers up or occupies a large part of North America, and after all has more than 300 million people. I say with apologies to Canada, of course, because there is a second country in North America, and in terms of its actual territory, it's of course even bigger than the United States. But for practical purposes, one might consider the United States a kind of regional state or a continental state. Thinking about this issue in these ways, can you think of any other continental states? Russia, maybe, which basically covers a large part of perhaps northern Europe and northern Asia. You might even consider it an interregional state in and of itself. Can you think of any others? Sorry? Brazil? Okay, it's a large part of Latin America, South America, that's true. Although, well, yeah. I guess it's as big a part of Latin America or South America as the United States is of North America. Okay. There's one very evident continental state no one's mentioned so far.
China.
Oh, China, sometimes described as a continent, quite a large part of East Asia, but there are other countries there as well. Australia, of course. Australia is the continental state. I think the only continent in the world which is united by a single political system, by a single state, albeit a federal state. Huh? Imagine if the great expanse of Australia was as green and fertile and lush and as habitable as the interior of the United States. Were that the case, probably Australia could be the great world power. But the combination, basically, of the territorial sort of reach of the United States, the habitability of most of its territory, therefore its large population and its wealth, make it a kind of continental state that is far more capable of cohesive action and has far more potential power than any other state or any other regional organization in the world. So therefore, when it comes to what very loosely might be described as interregional relations, actually, the United States is an absolutely key actor. Let's have a look at this, or illustrate this point in relation to the ties that link the United States to Europe on the one hand and to Asia on the other. As we know, of course, Western Europe and North America are very tightly linked in terms of defense and security through the NATO. 28 member states, two of them in North America, the US and Canada, all the others, of course, in Europe. Can you think of any NATO member states that don't belong to the EU, or EU member states that don't belong to NATO? Russia doesn't belong to NATO, that's true. Yeah. Nor to the EU, for that matter.
You have some of the Baltic, the states.
Scandinavian states?
No, sorry, the Balkan.
The Balkan states? Okay, yeah, I don't think Serbia is yet actually in either one or the other. Croatia, I think, is not yet a member, is probably a member of both. I can't think of one that belongs to NATO and not to the EU, or one that belongs to the EU and not to NATO very easily.
Isn't Turkey a NATO state?
Turkey is a NATO member but not an EU member. Norway is a NATO member and not an EU member. And of course, on the other hand, there's a handful of EU member states that don't belong to NATO, that have long traditions of neutrality. So Sweden belongs to the EU but not to the NATO. And of course, the same is true of Austria. All this relates really to the sort of historical background of the Cold War. No? Okay? But the NATO is actually, I think, if one thinks about interregional cooperation in this sort of rather loose way, it is probably the shiny example and the most sort of evident example of effective interregional cooperation. After all, it managed to win the Cold War without firing a single shot. That's not bad. Many security experts thought following the end of the Cold War basically would fall apart because the common enemy, namely the former Soviet Union, didn't really exist any longer and no longer could pose a security threat either to Western Europe or to North America. But in fact, NATO lives on, has far more members today than it had at the end of the Cold War. Almost all the countries in former communist Europe to the west of the former Soviet Union are now NATO member states. And of course, it found a new lease of life with the emergence of all these new kinds of security threats, such as international terrorism, particularly after the events of 9/11 in the US. This is the first instance in which basically a member state of the NATO called on the sort of mutual defense obligations of other member states to actually help it out. So when the Americans basically appealed to the other NATO member states to engage with it militarily, of course, in the invasion of Afghanistan. So paradoxically, NATO was first really used sort of as a kind of military force to cope with a conflict that lay far outside of the borders of North America or Western Europe. The second strand of relations between the United States and the EU, of course, are economic. And here, for a very long period of time, basically, the Americans and the Europeans made do with the international multilateral rules and organizations, so the World Trade Organization, or its predecessor, the GATT, as it was up until 1995. And it might be an indication of a kind of resurgence of interregional relations that nowadays, because it's proved so difficult to reach any kind of new agreements between all the 130 odd, perhaps 150 member states of the WTO, because the trade negotiations at the WTO level have basically been paralyzed and are in stalemate, that in the last few years there has been a concerted attempt to actually try and bring about something like a transatlantic free trade area. That's really what is behind this project known as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It will basically, as it's envisaged, will abolish any remaining tariff barriers to trade between the EU member states and the United States, and also will try and tackle a lot of the very important so-called behind-the-border obstacles to free trade across the Atlantic. So all kinds of sort of product standards, things to do with genetically modified food, with hormone beef and so on, or technical standards regarding automobiles that, as things now stand, still basically pose certain kinds of problems to free trade across the Atlantic. So the transatlantic trade and investment partnership is something to keep one's eye on, but realize this certainly would significantly strengthen the ties between the North Atlantic and European regions. The question that remains still unanswered, and obviously is absolutely fundamental, is will they actually find an agreement, the Europeans and the US Americans? And if so, we're talking about the executives of both sides of the Atlantic, if so, will this accord be ratified and approved by the legislatures in both regions? Because remember, since the Lisbon Treaty 2009, every new external trade agreement negotiated by the European Union must pass the European Parliament. That's very important, particularly as far as the European Parliament may transpire to be more protectionist than the member states. It could pose a very important obstacle to the entry into force of any agreement reached between the negotiating parties. Second possible obstacle, of course, is the American Congress. None of it comes from the United States, I take it. Right? But you may nonetheless know that, again, whenever the American president, the executive branch, negotiates an external trade agreement, this must be ratified, approved by both houses of the American Congress, both by the House of Representatives and by the Senate. And normally, in order to actually to get congressional approval, the Congress must give the president so-called fast-track authority to negotiate a trade deal. It's nowadays called trade promotion authority. And under this authority, basically, the president can negotiate and reach an agreement with another country and can put this agreement then to the Congress for a straight up and down vote, yes or no, within a very restricted period of time, which I remember, I think is actually 3 months. Unfortunately, if you're in favor of free trade, President Obama, at the present time, does not have this fast track or trade promotion authority. And that could constitute a very, very big stumbling block, again, to the ratification of any agreement that the EU and the US might reach about trade liberalization. Free trade does not exactly have a very good reputation these days in the United States, and really since the 1990s, early 1990s, since NAFTA was adopted, every sort of free trade agreement on which the United States has embarked has been surrounded by a very high level of domestic political controversy and opposition. So,
it's like if pro is the opposite of con, what's the opposite of progress?
You think there might be, you're suggesting there might be some kind of regression, or? Okay, so that's the United States and the EU. These are two regions that might argue that do have quite intense, high levels of exchange and political, especially security cooperation. It's looking for an answer to the question why it is that the West basically has had a very dominant influence on world affairs over the course of the last 60 years, and especially, of course, since the end of the Cold War, then here is where you find one of the answers. Obviously, it's a lot to do with the military might of the United States especially, and the wealth of these two very sort of large regions, but it also has to do with the fact that they have really quite, as compared to other regions, quite high and intensive levels of cooperation. And despite the fact that it was predicted that NATO would sort of dissolve after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as you can see, it remains very much in existence, even if when it comes to sort of conflicts like Syria, Libya, and so on, Not all of NATO member states agree. Typically nowadays they form so-called coalitions of the willing, involving those member states who are prepared to deploy their military force to actually intervene in any given conflict.
Sorry, and
Yep.
Canada, do they not want to be involved in it?
Sorry?
Does Canada not want to be involved in it?
Canada most certainly is in the NATO. I think it's probably taken part in most of the military interventions that NATO has been involved in since the end of the Cold
But
War.
the TTIP,
Sorry, Canada is not involved. No.
it's not interested?
Sorry?
It's not interested right now?
Well, there are separate negotiations going on between the EU and Canada, so there could still be a bilateral trade agreement between Canada and the EU. No? This, of course, underlines the fact that in NAFTA there's no customs union. That's to say, no common external tariff. One might imagine, though, that the United States wouldn't be very keen if there were to be an agreement between the EU and Canada, which would lead to sort of lower trade barriers between these two regions or countries than between, let's say, the EU and the US, because then, of course, European exports into Canada could enter the United States via NAFTA. Okay. I don't know if Pascaline would like to add something on transatlantic relations, because I know that's something about which he knows a great deal more than I do.
Maybe later.
Okay, fine. So, second pattern or second area of what I would describe as sort of quasi-interregional relations between the United States and Asia. And here things on the security front are, of course, a little bit different to the situation in the North Atlantic. NATO was an avowedly multilateral security organization in which you have cooperation between the 28 member states in this one organization, albeit dominated by the United States, which account for something like, I think, 72% of all NATO military spending at the present time. In Asia, you find a quite different pattern. There's no regional security organization as such, but a very large number of alliances on a bilateral basis between the United States and individual Asian countries. So these, of course, the most important by far, given the size of these countries and their economies, the treaties between Japan and the US and South Korea and the US, which of course have their roots in the period of the Cold War going back to the late 1940s and early 1950s. There are also, however, quite important military ties of a more informal and sort of de facto or ad hoc character between the United States and some countries in Asia. Really, to come from Singapore, for example. If you are flying to Singapore or fly to Singapore occasionally, you come in to the Changi airport and you might see just beneath the aircraft wing a couple of large American sort of destroyers or frigates tied up to the harbor in Singapore. There's no military treaty between Singapore and the US, but Singapore attaches a very high value to having quite close security ties and military ties to the United States. This is very much a function of the perceptions other Asian countries have, in particular of China and China's future power and how China might sort of behave in the future. In the last few years, especially as China seems to have become rather more aggressive or belligerent in sort of its foreign policy rhetoric, a lot of countries around Asia have begun to sort of forge, at least on an informal level, closer military ties to the United States. So the United States remains very important to kind of provide a lot of security to many countries in Asia. And then on the economic and trade front, there is an organization which links the two sides of the Pacific in a way that not even Europe and the United States or North America are linked. That is in, whoops, sorry, I don't go too far here. That's in particular the APEC, sometimes known by the acronym, or its acronym sometimes translated as a perfect excuse for a chat. That says something already about what the APEC has got up to and how it's developed over the course of the last 25 years of its existence. It is one of the international organizations, or in this case, a interregional organization, where Australia actually played a very important role in its creation. Notably, the Prime Minister of the late 1980s, Bob Hawke, and his successor, the other Labour Prime Minister, Paul Keating. Australia was very keen at this time to forge more rules-based, or more strongly rule-based sort of trade relations across the Pacific Ocean, because it had the sense that trade relations between Japan and the United States were getting very difficult. At this point of time, Japanese exports to the United States were rising very, very fast. A lot of temptation, very strong temptation in the United States to impose barriers on Japanese exports to the United States. And Australia, like other countries in the region, thought that it might somehow be a kind of victim, a kind of a sort of collateral damage of some kind of trade conflict between Japan and the United States. So Australia played a very, very central role in launching the APEC. Japan also itself was quite supportive, because it thought, again, if you had stronger, sort of more constraining rules governing trade across the Pacific, then this would diminish the scope for the United States to actually apply unilateral trade sanctions or tariff barriers on exports from other countries. So hence the APEC, and APEC is actually rather interesting, because at least in a formal sense, governments are not members of the APEC, but rather economies. And as you might get to think about it carefully, this was a very imaginative and creative ruse or device which made it possible for countries, quote unquote, to join the APEC, which don't normally belong to international organizations. And I'm thinking here especially about Taiwan, or as it's called in APEC jargon, Chinese Taipei, and Hong Kong, which is, I think, labeled Hong Kong, China. Hong Kong and Taiwan are both members of the APEC, and something was agreed in the early 1990s, in a period in which basically was a very important thaw in relations between China and other countries, and China was very keen to become more closely integrated into the international and into the sort of pan-Pacific economy. I'm not quite sure if nowadays if Taiwan wanted to join the APEC, that it would be as easy as it was in the early 1990s. But what does APEC do? How much do you read about, hear about APEC, follow the news media? Any of you sort of pass through border controls, and you have a nice sort of APEC lane? You might have come across this in different parts of Asia, or here, perhaps even here in Australia. So they have facilitated so basically sort of transition or movement across borders in a certain limited sense.
I think one of their chief objectives is to discuss security. So you have a border.
Yeah. And there might be a certain amount of cooperation, exchange information on things like sort of terrorism or terrorist threats. That's certainly true. And these summits, they take place once a year, again for a day. Certainly an occasion for heads of government to attend the APEC summits, actually, to sort of talk about all kinds of things they might not normally get a chance to talk about. So they can be quite important sort of bilateral conversations on the margins of the APEC summits between different heads of government, let's say between the American president and perhaps the head of the Chinese Communist Party, and so on. They certainly had a very ambitious plan to liberalize Pan-Pacific trade going back to 1994. There was a so-called Bogor Declaration coming from the town in Indonesia, quite close to Jakarta. But when the Asian financial crisis struck in the late 1990s, basically trade liberalization through the APEC seemed to sort of grind to a pretty sort of sudden halt. And it's from that era, from that sort of era, I think, or from that sort of turning point, you get this informal label for APEC, a perfect excuse for a chat. A certain amount of talk and discussion takes place, but nothing really gets decided, let alone implemented in the member states as part of some kind of common APEC policy. However, the same is true for US-Asian relations as is true for US-European relations. In the course of the last couple of years, again against the background of the stalemate in the WTO trade liberalization negotiations, a new project has been launched to try and promote trade between the Western and the Eastern Pacific. It's the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership. Have you heard much about this in Australia? Not yet? Now, if you're in the anti-globalization movement, you'll probably be thinking quite a bit about this, because some people in the anti-globalization movement are very suspicious of what's being discussed and negotiated in connection with the TPP. And they have a certain amount of reason to be a bit suspicious, because what's actually under negotiation here has been kept pretty much under wraps and been kept fairly secret. The negotiating countries don't really want to come out and actually say what's on the table for negotiation until such time as they finally put together some kind of agreement. And the aim is, as things now stand, I think, to reach an agreement by the end of this year. So you'll certainly hear a good deal more about the TPP in the next few months than you've heard so far. But similar to the transatlantic free trade agreement, this is supposed to be a quite ambitious sort of an agreement where not only tariff barriers to trade are reduced or in fact abolished, but again, all kinds of technical obstacles to trade and all kind of behind the borders barriers to trade are supposed to be abolished. So the Americans, if they're very keen to have this agreement, all kinds of things to do with environmental standards, all kinds of things to do with labor standards, and in particular to have very strict rules to protect foreign direct investments in the other member states. To the point where the latest going so far as to give private companies the possibility to actually launch lawsuits against member states who don't respect their property rights. So you can imagine this is a very sensitive issue for some of the member states, and a very sensitive issue for a lot of the NGOs, anti-globalization groups and so on, that try to keep an eye on these kind of negotiations. Who's involved in the TPP? Japan. Sure.
Is it Chile?
Sorry? Chile. It actually began with a very strange group of original signatories. Brunei, one. Chile, which is probably the most sort of market-oriented country in South and Latin America. Which is the most market-oriented country in East Asia or Southeast Asia? With the most open economy? Singapore, Southeast Asia. Singapore, and Australasia, of the two countries, which is the more free trade oriented, would you guess? As between Australia and New Zealand. In case of doubt, it's we Kiwis. Huh? So the four original TPP member states were Singapore, Chile, Brunei, and the United States. And New Zealand. You'll never find any kind of major international project that's been launched by four so insignificant countries as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Brunei, 500,000 people, Singapore, 5 million, New Zealand, 4 million, Chile, I think actually a few more. Huh? It probably wouldn't have developed needed momentum that it has actually done in the meantime had the United States not jumped on board 3 years after it was launched in 2008. And for the United States, a very critical question is going to be basically for the fate of the TPP, what's going to happen with China? Because China is not so far involved in the TPP talks, and a lot of the issues and a lot of the likely provisions of the TPP concerning environmental standards, labor standards, investment protection and so on, would certainly pose very great problems for China, which is not so far said one way or the other whether or not it will take part in TPP or not. But there are some malign people who believe that the United States is pushing the TPP project very strongly in order to be able to exclude China and to reach an agreement which China would find it impossible to actually take part in and participate in. So a very important aspect or issue as regards to TPP is whether or not China will be able to join, whether or not the United States wants China to join, and whether or not, if it's actually finally adopted, it won't actually create a new kind of division or cleavage through the middle of Asia between most other Asian states on the one hand, especially the richer ones with more open economies, and China and the less developed economies in Asia on the other. So that's certainly an issue to keep an eye on in the context of US-Asian relations. Then finally, let's come to the last sort of the three pillars. If you're thinking about a kind of the possible emergence of a trilateral world order, as people such as Manny were thinking about, going back to my opening remarks of the session, we should spend a little bit of time as well talking about relations between Asia and Europe. Because historically, at least since the Second World War, this was by far the weakest of these sort of three pillars. There were quite close North Atlantic relations, there were quite close relations between the United States and at least a certain number of Asian countries that have been broadened since the end of the Cold War. But following the collapse of the colonial empires and the Second World War, basically, political ties, at least between Asia and Europe, were really quite weak. All this was supposed to be transformed and reversed through the creation of ASEM, Asia-Europe Meeting. I tried to think of an acronym that would be suitable and could be applied to the Asia-Europe Meeting, but unfortunately I didn't succeed. But if you sort of transfer the sort of the idea behind APIC as a perfect excuse for a chat, if you can think of something similar for ASEM, I would certainly like to hear about it, because frankly, it does even less, I think, than any other kind of interregional organization. It means also, I think, Peter?
Asia sick of Europe not turning up.
Asia sick of Europe not turning up. This would be quite good. Thank you. That's pretty much perfect, I think, because indeed, when ASEM meets, very often the European sort of seats are vacant, or at least instead of the Prime Minister or the President turning up, then it might be the sort of the head of the sort of the Foreign Ministry, perhaps, or the Trade Ministry, or so on. It doesn't really have a very high profile. You might ask yourself, well, why was it set up in the first place? And to my knowledge, basically, the driving forces behind ASEM were on the Asian side, Singapore, and on the European side, in particular, France. The Singaporean Prime Minister, who was very much in favor of this, was Goh Chok Tong. At the time in France, of the presidency of Jacques Chirac, who was very interested in Asia. And privately, I did actually once hear that when President Chirac was in Singapore discussing and advocating the creation of ASEM, he actually met had a conversation about it with the Singaporean elder statesman Lee Kuan Yew. This was in the mid-1990s, and reportedly Lee Kuan Yew, after Chirac had actually expounded this project to him, thought for a moment and said to Chirac, But where's the meat in all of this? Where's the meat? And in actual fact, I think neither then nor subsequently can one really find very much meat in the ASAM. Again, meets once a year, I think for a day, or not much more than a day. Not everyone turns up, as supposed to. And nothing really gets decided. And that's like somewhat strange, and I have to say I haven't got an explanation for the fact that more and more actually countries have wanted to join the ASEAN and have actually joined it in the course of time. Now actually it involves Russia, now involves India, Australia got involved, New Zealand got involved, Pakistan has become a member, and all 51 members, that's about 1/4 or more of the entire sort of number of nation states in the entire world. Why they all want to belong, I'm not quite sure, but one explanation for why they've been allowed to join is that the original member states said to themselves, this is actually so unimportant, we don't really mind, have no objection to anyone joining whatsoever. So ASEM, as a kind of pillar of cooperation between Asia and Europe, has never assumed anywhere near the same importance, in particular the NATO across the North Atlantic, or even alongside the APEC. It actually looks relatively puny and weak, I would say. So when it comes to sort of economic and trade ties, as well as security ties, basically, there hasn't been historically any particularly sort of concerted attempt to establish a kind of trans-regional agreement or sort of rules between Europe and Asia. Until recently, they've been quite happy to sort of have their economic and trade ties regulated through the World Trade Organization, that's to say at the international multilateral level.